All right, Messianic Michael back with you, and today we have a striped bass that the Lord provided in answer to prayer. And you may be asking, hey, how come this guy always talks about the importance of asking Jesus for fish? I know lots of people who don't pray and they catch big fish and lots of fish and this kind of thing, and that may well be true. The Bible says that God sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. But in my own experience, I've caught a whole lot more fish and bigger fish since I learned to pray. When my children were young, they wanted to learn how to fish and wanted to learn how to start catching fish. And I was a man of faith, and I wanted to provide them with a better fishing experience than I had with my own dad, who, it was always growing up, going fishing with my dad. We should have been there yesterday, because yesterday they did really well, and today we weren't doing so well. And I wasn't holding my mouth right and this kind of stuff. But when I learned to pray for fish and for wisdom in fishing and for success, then the scriptures became true for me, that I was able to exert the authority that mankind is given as rulers over the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, and especially, the fish of the sea. All right, so this is a 8-inch Dexter Russell fillet knife. And we're going to use a little stouter knife than we usually use here, because this striped bass is about 16 inches long, maybe between 1 and 2 pounds, and we're going to still be cutting through the bones in the rib cage. And a stouter knife is a little better to get through the thicker bones of the rib cage of these striped bass once you get into the ones that are a little, well, bigger than small. I might call this one medium sized here. So just cut down, and now we're going along the backbone, but we're cutting through those ribs. And this is where the thicker knife really helps. Once you get past the last rib, you can go ahead and switch over to the regular 7-inch Dexter Russell fillet knife and finish off. Alright, so the fillet is separated from the backbone, or at least the first one is, and so now we can go to the second one. And before I continue, I'll mention that before I hit the on button on the video camera, I gave them 15 swipes with the coarse and the fine side of the little sharpener here, because a sharp knife cannot be overemphasized when it comes to the importance of things to be mindful of when you're filleting fish. Alright, down the backbone, hang right toward the tail. And I'm just going to go ahead and finish this one with the thicker knife rather than swapping. And then now we can turn our attention to getting the fillets off the skin as the next step. And because there's different ways to do this, I like to use a pair of pliers to hold the fillets when I make this cut. Some people like to leave it on the fish and flip it over and the skin tag holds it. Other people like to use a fork against the cutting board. There's other ways to do it, and there's no one just right way. I prefer the pliers. Alright, so the fillet is separated from the skin. Separate the next fillet from the skin. Alright, now we've got to deal with the issue of the ribs. But before we do that, let's just sort of clean stuff off a little bit here. I'm just going to rinse, and then we'll come back into the video once I've rinsed things off. Alright, so we've rinsed things off, and I like to remind people all the time that when you're working with food, you want everything to be clean, even if that slows you down a little bit. And that applies to everything from skinning a squirrel to gutting a deer, cutting up this kind of animal or that kind of animal. It's a whole animal when you begin with, but the reason why we consider it such a blessing is because they're made out of meat, and God's given us food. So we want to keep all of our food preparation surfaces clean in the process. So now we're just angling the knife a little backwards. Some people who are a little more skillful perhaps, they can kind of swoop under there with a lot of care and save a little more of that meat. I realize people who are watching my videos are probably a little less experienced and maybe aren't that skillful with the fillet knife, and so I try and do it in a way that's attainable by most viewers. So a couple of nice fillets here. I'm feeling around to see if any bones have snuck in or crept in. And no, these two very nice striped bass fillets from that 16-inch striped bass. Alright, this striped bass is bigger, about 7 pounds, 25 inches long. And this is about the borderline for whether I like to cut through the ribs in the first cut when removing the fillet from the backbone, or whether or not I prefer to cut around the ribs. But this fish, it has a little younger look to it. It looks like it grew quickly, so I'm going to make the decision and keep this one in the medium size and use the 9-inch Dexter or 8-inch Dexter Russell to cut through the ribs. Much bigger than this, and then it's a larger striped bass, and a different technique would be more appropriate where you'd want to not try and cut through the ribs. But let's go ahead and begin here. This fish was fun to catch. He grabbed the blueback herring and he took off and was peeling off drag, and a lot of excitement catching this fish yesterday. Alright, so the first cut is behind the head, going down to the backbone, and then turn the knife toward the tail. Wow, those ribs are a little harder than I pictured in my mind. Considering that I may have made an error deciding to cut through the ribs on a fish this large. I may have guessed wrong. The fish might be a little older than I was first supposing. Let me give it another moment here, push against these ribs and see what happens. Nah, they're not coming. So I'm going to go ahead and, instead of cutting through the ribs, switch to the other fillet knife. Work the fillet knife now, and I'm only cutting from the top of the back here. I'm cutting down to the rib cage, which the rib cage is about at this level here. Have to feel your way along a little bit through the internal bone structure there, and then once you get behind the vent, behind the rib cage, once you go ahead and poke the knife out the bottom of the fish and just continue removing the fillet. Alright, so now we've got the fillet removed from the backbone. Let me see if we can turn it and show the camera a little better. The fillet is separated from the backbone here, but it's still hanging on to the ribs. Oops. The fillet is still hanging on to the ribs in there, so we can use the fillet knife. Be careful with your hand, with your fingers, and just start to peel the fillet off of the ribs. Alright, now we got it here off the ribs all the way down to the skin, and we just have a few more inches right there of the fillet on the ribs. Alright, so now the fillet, looking at it from the meat side, is, and there's a little more ribs there, but there's no real meat to speak of between the ribs and the skin. So now we go ahead and we're just cutting through the skin separate the fillet and the skin from the rest of the fish. Alright, well, had we made the first right choice to begin with, not trying to cut through the ribs, that would have been a little easier, but here we are, and we managed to do a fairly good job and get most of the meat. Alright, well, now we're a little wiser having the experience of the first side. So now we're going to go ahead and take due care from the beginning with the plan to not cut through the ribs. So we go ahead and make our cut here, and I use the bigger, stouter knife, still getting through the scales, because it can be kind of a bear trying to get through the scales with the thinner fillet knife. I'll go ahead and give it a few swipes, because we can stand to be working with a sharper knife here as we separate the fillet from the backbone. And we're on top of the ribs, so I'm only pushing the knife down to, I feel the ribs stop the knife, because we're not really cutting through the ribs, we're just working with the part that's on top of the ribs. And notice I like all my fingers and toes, so I try not to, sometimes you need to gyrate in funny directions so that you're not pushing a sharp knife toward the hand that you're holding the fish with. Alright, so now we've got the fillet separated from the backbone except for the ribs. Open it up, work in there a little bit, work the knife along the ribs, and at some point you realize you're to the point where the ribs are so close to the skin that there's not a whole lot of meat left, and then we can go ahead and separate. Use the bigger knife to go ahead and cut through the skin and separate from the skin. Alright. And we'll go ahead and since we are working with food, rinse things off. Alright, so the next step is going to be to use the fillet knife to separate the fillet from the skin. And you never have a knife too sharp, and freshen the sharpness a little bit. Different ways to hold down the tail. Some people like to just hold a fork. I like pliers. Come in, get down the skin, shimmy along, pressing the knife between the skin, and using the knife to press the skin against the cutting board, and then working your way all the way down. So all we have is a nice big striped bass fillet. Wow, that's going to be good. Alright, we got the other fillet here. Same thing, other side. Hold the fillet by the tail end with a pair of pliers. Get down, and the knife is really squeezing the skin up against the cutting board as you're working along. And you're pushing the knife kind of hard this way, but you're actually holding and pulling with the same force with this hand to hold everything steady as you work the knife along. So now we have a second nice large striped bass fillet. Praise Jesus.